I was about to say welcome back to the room where it happened, because that's how I start most episodes of A Fork in Time, but that would not actually be accurate, because this is sort of the first full episode of the room where it happened, and we're excited to have you here. This is Don sitting in the host chair with a cast of five, a cast of characters too. As I look here at what's on my screen, you can't see what I can see, but really excited about the fact that we are finally to the first full episode of the room where it happened. So if you found us, I'm presuming at this point you might be a Fork in Time listener, so you might be familiar with who we are, but you may have found us some other way. So however you got here, we're glad that you found your way here, and we're very happy to have you for this first full endeavor into A Fork in Time. Just to give you the quick background again, I'll reference our other podcast, A Fork in Time, probably a number of times through this. By the way, if you're not a listener, I would suggest checking it out. But the format of that forecast is alternate history. That is not the format of this podcast. The format of this podcast is actual history, but we're going to take it from an angle, and that angle is going to be the idea of the quote unquote room. And so I also have here, I'm happy to have here, she's sort of near and dear to me. She's about to be near and dear to somebody else. She went and got engaged. Golly, we'll talk about that probably at some other point on a lot of other things. But I have my daughter here as the co-founder of Fork in Time, and she gets the credit for being co-founder of the room where it happened. Alexis, tell our listeners, first of all, let them hear your voice, then tell the listeners what was our inspiration for the room where it happened.
Hi guys. Yes, I did go get engaged. So we'll talk about that at some point. But I'm really happy to be joining my dad and my other people that I can see on my screen along this journey here. But yeah, the room where it happened is based on, and I was actually listening to the song before we started recording, is based on the Compromise of 1790. And it is based on the song really from Hamilton, which talks about the Compromise of 1790. If you've never heard that song before, I suggest it, but I do warn you, it will get stuck in your head.
Yeah, and so the idea here was that we thought we would take our gander at these historical events using the framework of the quote unquote room. Most of the time, I think that's going to be a physical room with a physical door, but we may get metaphorical with that at some point. Yankee Stadium may qualify as a quote unquote room at some point or something like that. But I think there's plenty of actual rooms that we can exhaust before we get to that. And again, the idea is of a less frequent, in terms of like a once a month frequency of a podcast, which also makes it ability for us to go a little bit longer and to not feel it as contained as we do on the weekly format for A Fork in Time. I'm really excited to have some of the folks that have joined us on A Fork in Time being part of our initial panel here. And the other goal of the room where it happened is to have just sort of this interchangeable group of characters that come and go episode to episode, and maybe even have some episodes that don't require me or that don't require Alexis. That would be an ideal world to live in someday when it comes to producing a podcast. I know Robert, for example, who's on the show, is part of a weekly podcast as well. So it's enjoyable, but it can be a little bit of a grind or feel like an obligation from time to time. It hasn't quite got that way with A Fork in Time, but we scramble a little bit. So what I was going to do here, go around here real quick, let the good folks that are here introduce themselves. Again, if you're a listener to A Fork in Time, you've probably heard them before or read their bio there on the website. And then we'll reset up the topic again, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and do what we're going to do here on Room Where It Happened, which is dissect the topic. So I'm just going to go the way that it appears on my screen, probably not their screen here on Zoom, but works going clockwise around. So I have Eric Rush in my upper left. So Eric, you get to go first.
Yeah, thanks, Don. It's good to be here. I'm glad to be collaborating with this group. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. So I'm Eric Rush. I joined Don for a couple of episodes recently. My interest has chiefly been in the history of science and medicine, but I have a lot of interest in history. It's not just limited to that, and so we're gonna test my American history chops tonight. It's been a while, but I think I can muddle through, and I've got some good people to help me. So I'm really glad to be here.
Cool. Good to have you, Eric. I've really enjoyed all the episodes we've done with all our guest hosts, but particularly because of Eric's medical specialty and some of the cool things that we did there. I really enjoyed those because those are a little bit different than the other ones that we did. We never went to England anywhere during any of your episodes, for example, just to call out one of the other folks.
You know what? I've been thinking about that. We can do England, alternate history, and science on the same episode. Guaranteed.
I'll do one of those with you, Eric.
Yeah, yeah, we may do that. As I
Deal.
move as I move around the circle here, I have a Fork in Times regular contributor, agitator, cartographer. We're trying to get him elected Holy Roman Emperor. I think we decided to do that at one point. So, Chris Capola, Chris, let the folks know who you are if they don't already.
I am Chris Capola.
Yeah, I knew that was coming.
You deserve. You
I
don't need an introduction, Chris.
Yeah, he needs no
not
introduction.
particularly. I do want to say I kind of feel like this is hitting literally close to home for me because compromise of 1790s where I live.
That's right. You live in the D.C. area there, Chris. So
Absolutely.
we're gonna talk about how Chris got to be where he is, or at least it being the nation's capital. It may not be how he got to be where it is, but I think you are there because it's the nation's capital. It does sort of all work together to some degree.
Okay.
So we'll go.
I didn't come here to take the weather.
Uh,
Do not do that. No, nobody.
I can appreciate that. And finally, last but not least, on the bottom part of my screen is Robert Koshu. Robert, it's actually been a while since we've done an episode together, but it's good to have you back. And so, Robert, tell the folks who you are.
Yeah. My name is Robert Koshu. Hello, everybody. Glad to be back on here with you guys. And for this in particular, Don mentioned I do a podcast, Man Up Spiritual Oasis for Men. It's a weekly, and like Don said, doing a weekly podcast can be a grind on occasion. You know, love doing it, lots of fun. But what I'm really looking for, I'm a history nerd. I worked in Nashville for about 16 weeks just to kind of give everybody my nerd chops. I went to the Battle of Chickamauga battle site on one of my Saturday weekends and spent 8 hours there and hiked the battlefield following the 7th Texas Regiment from the entire start to end of the battle. Did the same thing at Shiloh. So I'm a history nerd. I'm the guy who will pay willingly for his wife to go do a complete day spa so I can spend the entire day at the Admiral Nimitz Museum. So no one's bothering me to make me leave.
Yeah, there's Robert and I went to high school together. We've known each other for most of our lives. And I knew that about Robert when I asked him on to A Fork in Time and why I knew he'd be good here for the room where it happened. So again, Alexis sort of did set up a little bit the topic. I'm going to do that. If you haven't heard the full setup, you can go back and listen to the inaugural episode. But we're going to focus on the room. The room today is in New York City. The room today is either probably a combination of the dining room or the parlor of a one home that was been resided in by Thomas Jefferson. And in 1790, Jefferson's role is that of Secretary of State. He's back from having been the ambassador to France during most of the period of time of the Revolutionary War and in the early days of the Articles of Confederation. We got this new thing called a constitution that we managed to get adopted. And as a result of that, Jefferson comes back to be the first Secretary of State under Washington's first administration. And the guy you may have heard of, you know, this little musical got written sort of about him. It's all a buzz. A guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton. He shows up on your $10 bill. He's the $10 founding father, for those of you that are familiar with the music from Hamilton as well. And he's the Secretary of Treasury. And so the Compromise of 1790, while Madison is there and Madison plays an important role, I'm talking about James Madison here, it really is normally considered to be the compromise between Jefferson and Hamilton because they were the two cabinet level secretaries and had, at least on the executive side of the house, had more in the game. Madison is a congressman from Virginia. Virginia is the most populous. I think that's true. More populous than New York. I'd have to stop and catch myself for a minute. But Virginia is by far the dominant state in terms of sort of where it is geographically, but also in terms of population during the early part of the United States, the constitutional United States. And this Compromise of 1790 is about trying to come to a resolution about two open topics that are both lingering in Congress. One of them is Hamilton has put forward a plan whereby which the federal government would assume the Revolutionary War debts that were undertaken by the states when we were still a confederation of states and not hadn't created the federal republic that exists under the Constitution. And there's this open question that's been left by the Constitution about the fact that there's going to be a federal district where the capital will reside that's not part of any state, that's going to be separate. We'll probably spend some time, I'm sure, as we talk about the topic, talking about why that is and why that's important, because there were some real reasons for why that was going to be important. But of course, everybody wants the capital to be where they are. So that's become a point of contention as well. So the capital issue is open. Hamilton is having great difficulty getting those that oppose the idea of the federal government assuming debt to take on his plan to do so. And so a deal gets struck. This compromise of 1790, and that's what we're going to talk about. And the deal is that Hamilton gets his financial plan, and two guys from Virginia get the capital really close to them, as it sits in they're on the I guess technically they called that the eastern bank of the Potomac, I think was actually what was written in the legislation. And so we're going to see that it's, in fact, this will be what the title of the episode is. It's Capital Squared, capital for capital. And we'll see how that actually plays out when we come back from the break, and we hope that you stick with us.
Hi there, guys. This is Alexis and
Don?
Taking a little break from the podcast to tell you about one of our favorite things, and that is what, Dad?
That's Audible. And
what does Audible do?
Audible does everything. At least it does everything when it comes to playing audio programming for you. So that's, I typically think of it as being audio books, but it's not just books. It can be periodicals, magazines, theatrical productions, podcasts even now. Just anything that you can imagine that is audio can come through Audible.
Absolutely, absolutely. We, of course, we are avid readers, both Dawn and myself, but we like to be lazy sometimes with our reading. We like to be read too, so that's where Audible comes in. And if you're like us and you like reading, but maybe want to try being read to for a change, we have a little deal for you to check out Audible. What's that deal?
The deal is an opportunity for you to get a 1-month free subscription to Audible, which comes with 1 credit. A credit is how you purchase, again, an audio book, an audio program, whatever the case might be. And so if you follow the either the link that's in our show notes or go to www.audibletrial.com/aforkintime, you'll be connected there. You can see how to sign up. And again, you'll get that 1 month at no charge, a chance to try it, see if you like it. And you'll also get 1 credit, which will go towards, again, an audio purchase. That could be a book, fiction, nonfiction, whatever it might be. And I guess the other thing to mention, Lex, is what happens if you also happen to be an Amazon Prime member?
That means you actually get 2 credits. And as we get into the holiday season, I'm sure a lot of people are taking advantage of Amazon Prime. So take advantage of this too. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you actually get 2 credits with this deal instead of 1. So maybe 2 books.
Yeah, 2 books. Or that way you can check out different variety. You may choose a fiction and nonfiction genre, for example, to see how you like that. One of the things I know that Alexis and I often talk about is sometimes a great reader can actually make a good book even better. And a lot of the productions now, the audiobooks and other audio programs, are done by excellent readers. And I know for me, I can think of some of my favorites, don't want to belabor them here, but sometimes they can bring a whole new life into something you may have even already read before by hearing it spoken.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so we encourage you to take advantage of that offer. Again, that's a link in the show notes on our website, or go to www.audibletrial.com/aforkintime. Thanks.
If you stuck with us through the break, you know that you're at the room where it happened, and we've got a cast of folks here ready to talk about the Compromise of 1790. And the room is going to be we're assuming the dining room, so it's sometimes called the dinner table bargain. So we assume that this was worked out over dinner. They may have had a few drinks. Who knows? It's possible. In 1790 in New York City. So here we are. It's a young nation trying to get on its feet, and it's encountered its first need for a political crisis and a compromise. Anybody got some opening shots they want to fire, some opening salvos?
Yeah, I've got a couple, Don, and I just wanted, nobody can see me other than the people that are here on our Zoom call, but in honor of the French wine that Thomas Jefferson no doubt would have brought back to him from France, I'm drinking Missouri bourbon. So a little bit different, but still pretty good.
There you go.
So one of the things.
It,
So sorry, Don.
it'll loosen you up, I'm sure, as we progress through the episode.
Probably. One of the things that I thought is interesting about this compromise from the side of the debt issue was really that there were two separate issues. One of the issues was the kind of the philosophic issue of government reach. Is it proper for the government? Does it make sense for the government to assume this debt? And that was a topic where there was great disagreement. Well, the other thing that was interesting is that at the time of 1790, the owner of the debt, some of it was speculative, this debt fraction of its value. There value, or whether it should have some sort of tiered system for this.
And others may have had you drop out. Did anybody else have Eric drop out there a little bit? So Eric, I'm going to ask you to repeat that. We can clean it up, but had a little drop out there. You talk about the philosophical versus the practical aspects. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hang on 1 minute.
Sure. Somebody else jump in. We'll pick that topic back up with Eric.
What I find interesting, this is the first of three of the great compromises that occurred before the Civil War that really sets the tone, and kind of the idea was it's going to keep the country together. We have to do what we can to keep the Union of States together. And in reality, it sets us up for, and we can kind of bring this in as we move forward, but it sets us up for really the questions we're asking today. What is a state's responsibility versus what is a federal government responsibility? And this is the first of the compromises that kind of start setting that up as we move through and having that argument answered.
I agree. The more I started thinking about this, and again, for those of our listeners who are familiar with the Fork in Time, we normally try to stay away from the real deep political stuff here. It's allowed here. So, we're going to go there because we have to. But I was actually just thinking about that very fact of, we want to think that the struggles we're facing now as a nation when we try to figure this out are new. They're not. They were there from the very foundation of the nation. I'll let Eric make his point here again because I think it relates to this, but there was a philosophical question, but then there was also the practical question as well. And most compromises also tend to revolve around that, something philosophical as well as something practical. So Eric, if you want to make your point again, because I think you were making a really good one, I think we want to pick up off of. So picking back up on Robert's concept, do you think we have lost any of that ability to realize that compromise is part of the game? As you mentioned, there were three. The compromises I presume you're discussing or mentioning there would be 1790, 1820, 1850. It's interesting that the compromises all end in zeros. Those first big three compromises fit that mold. Do you think we're less inclined to compromise these days, or is it just that we think about it differently than they did then?
I don't think it's an accident they end in zeros. I would say it's almost a cyclical thing. And maybe that cycle has changed a little bit, but I would say I don't know that anything has fundamentally changed. I mean, we can talk about the modern discord, but politicians aren't shooting each other, which definitely happens. Not yet. Characters in this story.
Yeah.
Not to, spoiler alert, but yes.
I mean, we all,
that does happen.
Other than Alexis, I think all of us remember the milk commercial, which was honestly my introduction to Aaron Burr. I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, in fact, the interesting thing to me is that, again, this is in some degree inspired by, the musical Hamilton, which is about Hamilton, but Burr is the other major character in there. And it's probably the more, given the things that Burr represents in history, is actually somewhat obscure as a historical figure. In fact, there's a great biography of him called Fallen Father. I mean, he's one of the founding fathers, except he's sort of not. And that's an interesting thing that actually happens as a result of that is, his role that's there. But picking up on Eric's thought, I don't know if Eric's going to be able to join it. I hope that he'll get back in because I definitely want to have Eric continue that thought forward. But there was the philosophical question of should this very young nation, a nation that had just come to be in 1783 and had just passed its constitution and had come into its form that we more or less know it today, 1789 is with the election in 1788 is the question was should there be debt, because there was no real mechanism for even the taxation that would support that debt by the federal government as well. It was going to have to get its funding through, we didn't have a national income tax at the time. It was going to have to get it through tariffs and other means of accomplishing that. So I think, there was just the fundamental thing of should there be debt, and can this government even support debt, because it has no real direct means of raising money. So do you guys have any thoughts on just that philosophical question that was out there?
Well, the interesting thing is the compromise paves the way for us to have debt as a nation that then gets used by Jefferson to buy Louisiana.
Yeah.
And then gets used by Madison to fund the War of 1812.
So you're saying the guys that were against it were then the ones that turned right around and used it? Are you suggesting there's anything like that going on? No, certainly.
Oh, that never happens.
No, that never happens here.
No, not at all. Well, it's they're taking advantage of the situation that was set up for them, is what they're doing at the end of it, at the end of the day. And at the same time, you're looking at Hamilton, who I don't think, other than maybe wanting to be in New York, I don't think Hamilton cared where the capital was going to be. He was like, I get something for what I want, and I really don't have a dog in the hunt on where the capital ends up.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting thing, because I think Alexis and I talked about, I think it was on the episode that we did about different outcome of the War of 1812. And, the concept of, should the capital be relocated? How important was the capital? And I agree. Hamilton had very little. I think it would have been nice if it was in New York. I think a lot of people thought it should have been in New York, because that was the largest city, and definitely destined to be the largest city if it wasn't already the largest city by population directly. But in his mind, that was, first of all, he was Secretary of the Treasury, so he really didn't care, because he cared about what he cared about, which was the Treasury funding here. But also, I agree, it was an easy giveaway for him about where the capital was compared to what he wanted. And I think that's an interesting part of what's there. Chris, I see you look like you're about to say something.
The one thing I'd think about, you say that New York City makes sense as the nation's capital. New York City is not the capital of New York State.
True. True.
And when you sit here and think about it, there are, I would say, many, many states that do that. Even just...
You can't see that I'm vehemently shaking my head, because I agree with Chris.
I'm sitting here talking to a bunch of Texans, and where does Austin rank on just size of city in the state of Texas? I know Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, maybe San Antonio are all larger.
San Antonio's bigger.
Than
San Antonio's
the state
bigger.
capital.
There are suburbs of Houston that have larger populations probably than Austin
Not
does.
to mention thinking about Sacramento, California. So there is something to be said for choosing to locate political power away from popular or economic power.
Right. Well, and the other interesting thing that I was just going to mention here, because doing the research and going back and I started thinking, particularly because we now have a modern element of this, which is the concept of DC statehood. Whether this federal district, the irony is they intentionally wanted an area that was not a state, right? That's what it was called to be. And now we've come full circle back around to turning the area that was created as the federal district into a state, which is a little bit ironic to me. But I came across this incident, which probably was exposed to at some point in studying history, but had forgotten about, where when the capital, because the capital had moved around, it had been in Philadelphia. They were now meeting temporarily in New York. I mean, it was a circus tent kind of capital situation there for a while. I think a lot of people thought it would end up in Philadelphia, just because that's where other things had happened, and also being still somewhat central. I mean, it's really not that far from Philly to New York or to DC in terms of how far they are. but there had been an incident where I guess this was some of the soldiers who had not been paid certain things from the Revolutionary War marched on this would have been the Congress, I guess that was the Articles of Confederation Congress that was there in Philadelphia, and they marched on the proceedings, and the state of Philadelphia didn't do anything
Nope.
to stop them. So this idea was, if it was at least a federal district where you had the ability to regulate what was going on, you wouldn't have a situation where the citizens are about to hold the government. Wait a second. Never mind. I'm not even going to go there because I could really get in trouble really quick about what happens when citizens storm the Capitol. Again, that's happened here of recent vintage. So
I'm going to ask a question here, though, that I find interesting. So you just said these were veterans, these were troops that marched on the Articles of Confederation Congress for payment. Think about what we're talking about here. That happened before the Compromise of 1790, when the federal government assumed the financial responsibility for reimbursing states for this war debt. So that incident you're talking about, did that Congress, what was the role of that Congress in reimbursing these people? Wouldn't that have been the state of Pennsylvania's responsibility?
That great question, and it's always interesting. The two sides of the same coin are what seem to always pop up in all kinds of things and all kinds of things that go on. But yeah, to the point that we just talked about, the thing that was created so that it wouldn't be a state now wants to be a state. The where you locate your capital, big city versus small city, and in this case, we need the federal government or the centralized government to fund something. Wait a second, does it have any money to fund anything with, or what is it supposed to be funding is a whole different thing. I'm glad to see Eric made it back as well, so we'll get him plugged back into the conversation here with his comment. But I think that is intriguing, Chris, is that it's
and by the way,
and then as Robert mentioned, then the very two guys that are opposed to the federal government having this capability are the first two that go and use it in a big way to some degree in terms of Jefferson and Madison.
The one thing I will say, by the way, once you get a mob going, the niceties of federalism tend to go by the wayside.
Agreed. So, Eric, can you hear us? I see that you're back.
I can hear you. I've
all right.
partially recovered from my technical boggles.
No worries. So if we loop back, I'm going to do it because it's worthwhile. Eric, you were making a point about I think the philosophical versus the practical aspects of things, right?
I was making a point about that there were two main arguments concerning the debt issue. One was a philosophical argument about whether this is the proper use of a federal government, or whether it was appropriate for the federal government to assume the debt of what were predominantly debts from northern states as opposed to southern states. And that was an important philosophical argument where there was a lot of disagreement. But then there was a second argument that was do you reward all people equally? Do you assume the debt equally, noting that some of the holders by 1790 were speculators that were banking on the fact that they were likely to be paid back, and hopefully paid back for considerably more than what they acquired the debt for. And so there were some people like Madison that felt that this was inappropriate, and there were others that said, if we have a bunch of rich people who are vested in the federal government and in the success of the federal government, that's more likely to make it successful.
Yeah, I think that was Hamilton's other argument, was that, it's, yes, we know who, I don't think he ran from that from everything that I've read in terms of, knowing who many of the debt holders were, but that's exactly the reason why we need to make them whole over time, because as you said, they will have a vested interest in the success. They're invested. They're literally invested. They own the debt, and as a result, they're invested in the success of what's happening here. And to me, the other interesting thing, and I want to just hear the opinions as we sort of go around on this, is it just me, or do other people have this impression that we want to think of the founding fathers as being mostly agreeable on most things, but the further you dig into it and learn about it, it's sort of a miracle they got anything agreed upon, because they were so diverse in terms of their philosophical backgrounds, where they came from, agrarian versus what qualified for urban at the time. To me, it's even more striking the more that I learn about this and the older I get that they agreed on anything. Because when you really start digging into who they were as individuals, there's a lot of reasons for them to never agree on anything. Robert, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm kind of like you. The older I've got and the more I've dug into the more interesting parts of the history, it really has turned out to be, you know, it's amazing, and I think it's a lesson for us for today. That hey, you know what? We've got tons of disagreement, but guess what? We can sit down and come together to come up with some ideas. And I think, looking here, like we talked about, the two guys that oppose having debt, one of them is Jefferson, and he goes out and he uses if you look at it even today, a dubious ruling to acquire the debt he needed to buy Louisiana. So, if anybody wants to say, hey, we'll give it all back because we had a dubious ruling on whether or not we should use it or not. And I think that's kind of the thing is I think sometimes you got to put this stuff aside. But like you said, Don, these guys really, they had Washington, the slave owner who had huge military background compared to the Adams brothers from Massachusetts who lived in Boston. And yeah, John Adams farmed, but he wasn't a farmer.
Right.
They very, very hugely different personalities.
Well, and you mentioned the Louisiana Purchase, which is always something that I find very interesting because besides being a dubious ruling, if this hadn't occurred, there is no full faith and credit of the United States. That is a concept simply does not exist. And if you can't have that, nobody's going to lend you money. So then do we become sort of, landlocked, so to speak, or do we kind of stop at the Mississippi and never realize what eventually is manifest destiny?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Eric. And the other thing that popped in my mind is actually a episode that Chris and I did on A Fork in Time not that far back, where we were specifically talking about the situation with Mexico and being indebted to European powers and what happens as a result of that. Now, this case, the debt was owned by private citizens for the United States, but imagine a scenario where we had borrowed some money from, I guess, from the French as well and from the Spanish, and we would borrow money from others at various points. So if you don't have the full faith and credit, how do you know that you don't suddenly have a European power showing up at your door looking to install, in that case, an Austrian guy to be the emperor of Mexico, which is literally what happened in the middle of the 19th century in Mexico, as we were talking about on that particular episode leading up to talk about the Battle of Puebla. So, we avoided that scenario. Again, this is where the what if thing starts kicking into. If you don't do this, what becomes of the United States very quickly there? Again, to Eric's point, Jefferson doesn't have the resources or the means to go and make this what was a pretty thrifty purchase when you look at what we got for what we paid kind of thing, that it's easy to make the case for it. Eventually there's going to be, essentially what I think of as the second part of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. Madison's got to have the ability to fund that or else the nation is at risk. So again, how long does a nation last? Which I think was Hamilton's point. How long can a nation last if it doesn't have the means to fund what it needs to do? I see Chris nodding. What do you want to say, Chris?
Depends on which half the country wins out. I think the southern part of the country could very easily turn into a monocrop banana republic. I think the northern part of the country, because of its nascent industry, because of its reliance on trade, is going to be more tied into financial markets. And we absolutely see this in the debates of the 1790 Compromise and going forward. But it depends on which of those tendencies within the United States does finally win out.
Yeah.
Would you agree there, Chris, that in some ways that's also already a precursor or foreshadowing what eventually we're going to fight a war over in 1861 to 1865 to figure out, which is, yes, it was one united nation, but still thought of itself as the separate states. You probably remember from Ken Burns' The Civil Wars, where I first got this lesson really reinforced. the United States versus the United States, and the two different ways that we talked about that by which article went in front of it, whether it was a single unified nation or just a group of states that were together. Well, that gets ultimately decided regardless of how you think that should have been decided in 1865. But all of this is leading up to that, and the battle that's going on, slave versus free, yes, that's part of it, but industrializing versus agricultural, um, areas that are somewhat landlocked and have very limited ability to grow with areas that have very large abilities to grow and absorb population. I mean, in my mind, one of the early things that's happening here in the early American Republic is it's figuring out A, who it is, but B, figuring out how to stay together long enough to be who it's going to be, because it could have ended very quickly.
To add something else I'm thinking about, your confusion about the largest state in the United States when during this time frame, during 1790, it was Virginia. In a certain way of looking at it, the three compromises we're talking about bought Northern industrialism enough time to develop, to get to the point where when they finally, to some extent, put their foot down, barring some miracle, they're going to win. The other thing to think about is, just to throw this out there, the location of Washington. Robert, I cannot imagine what you would do living here. Just because, I mean, yeah, they're all right around here. And yes, Washington is located in the south. It's located near the north, and if it's not right there, tantalizingly close to Virginia. In fact, not at the point of the Civil War, but at the point of the creation of the district, part of Northern Virginia was part of the district. It later was given back to Virginia. Without that there, okay, yeah, sure, let's play some what ifs here. The entire strategy used by the Confederacy to try and win the war is completely different. Washington is swampland that has no meaning whatsoever.
Well, Chris, you bring up a really interesting point, and this is something I've thought for years. Honestly, is that every year that passes between 1789 and 1860, every year that passes is just that much greater of an advantage for the North. And in 1790, if it's a pitched battle, it's the South in a walk. In 1820, it's the South maybe a little bit tougher of a battle. 1840, it's still probably the South by a nose. But by 1860, the North is a huge factory and a sprawling farm. And that's just it's a totally different set of scenarios. So this is something I've actually thought for years. So it's interesting to hear you bring that out as well.
And if you look at what Northerners are saying around the Compromise of 1850, it's becoming pretty clear they're getting fed up. And part of it is maybe not even a consciousness of their power, but they are very much, there's the analogy of the, I'm sorry, Don, but of the teenager who's slowly growing and can finally take on their tormentor. Yeah, that's kind of where they're getting to.
Oh, it's interesting because Grant's one of Grant's first statements when he takes over command of the whole Union Army is, "We've been fighting this war to one hand tied behind our back. We're going to let the other hand out, and it's going to end." And in reality, that's what happened at the end of the day, because he literally said, "Whatever, let me alone. I'll go win this thing." And that's literally what he did. But and it's interesting you mentioned the location of DC as a part of that, and part of that strategy and where it ended up. The compromise puts it in Virginia, but also there was a little bitty sliver of Maryland, I believe, that became part of the district.
Part of my
That
home
joined.
county was given to the district.
Okay. And so it's Virginia, but it's also that, but it puts it, like you said, really at that point. Remember, this is a bunch of states on the eastern seaboard. So it puts it pretty much in the middle of the country, close to George Washington's home, which in a lot of ways kind of puts a central piece to it as far as where to put it. Because now you've got not only in the center of the country, but you've got the tie-in. Washington is from this area on the Potomac. And so it's a good sell to everybody else as to why are we putting it here? Well, it's in the middle of the country. This is where George wants it. You know, because George was president by acclamation at that point.
Yeah, he's the closest thing the United States will probably ever have to a king, in the sense of what he wasn't one. He was but again, there's two famous stories about Washington that I love. One of them is, during most of the time of the Continental Congress, he's sitting there in his regimental colonial militia uniform. So when they're thinking about who's going to command the armed forces, that guy over there.
By the way, what was his military record at this point?
Lousy. in terms of the Continental Congress.
Well, hold on. Beside the fact that he actually started the French and Indian War,
that is some.
It was
3D
like all his
testing.
fault to begin with.
Horribly. Like, on a certain level, yes, we have George Washington to thank for the founding of our country, because if he doesn't start the French and Indian War and lose it so horribly, the British don't have to send over so many troops and start taxing us. That's one way to look at this.
If you were a conspiracy theorist, Chris, and you believed
I don't believe
you
that.
Would think, yeah, you could actually make the case for that was Washington's plan all along, was to start this thing, bring the British over. That'll lead to taxation. That'll lead to a revolution. That'll lead to me leading the revolution. Hey, I'm president. It's carrying it through that way. If you wanted to take a really odd turn on that. That's from doing one too many episodes of A Fork in Time. You start thinking about the various things that are going on there. The other thing that jumped out at me was, though, that really popped at me again about who the people are in the room, the concept here, the room where it happened. We want to talk about Jefferson. We want to talk about Hamilton a lot. I think Madison gets short shifted, by the way, a lot of ways in American history. Arguably the father of the Constitution in terms of being one of the major movers and shakers during the Constitutional Convention and working through what that would be. And then two of the three men in the room are authors of Federalist Papers. Certainly Madison and Hamilton are those that have defended the Constitution. Hamilton writing an unbelievable number of the Federalist Papers, because that's what Hamilton did. He loved to write and he loved to argue in writing. But the concept that's in my head that really started playing off of, why it'd be fun to be in the room, the concept here, to actually hear what went down. Was it really more of a political deal? I'll give you this, you give me that. I think there definitely was that. It had to be that, or else it would have come out of that. But my guess is, knowing who was sitting in the room, that dude named Jefferson, that dude named Madison, that dude named Hamilton, back to your point, Eric, they talked philosophy when they were going around this at the same time while they were cutting the practical political deal too. And that part of the question is, what does the Constitution allow or not allow? Well, here's two of the guys in the room that within it's been just a very small number of years removed, a couple of years removed, who were writing pamphlets in defense of what does that document mean. And so two of the three guys in the room are, if you will, authors of the Constitution, defenders of the Constitution, but obviously having a different view on how it should work, or else they wouldn't be having this compromise.
Well, and the third guy that wrote the Declaration of Independence that started the whole thing feels short shrifted because he wasn't involved writing the Constitution, because he was shipped off to France during that whole time.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's when I think about just the brain power in that room, the awe of who was in that room, two presidents and a very influential part of what went on in early America. Who knows what would have happened if Hamilton hadn't died in a duel, who knows what the outcome would have been there. But just what went on in that room, I think probably 10%. This is just the way that I broke it down in my head. 10% of the talk was political. 90% of the talk probably still was around that political concept, to Eric's point, was very philosophical. And where the argument was not, should we do this, but should we be doing any of the things that are in this ilk? And they probably, chased, like I often do, they chased rabbits all over the place during that conversation. Oh yeah, but okay, back to the thing on the assumption and back to the capital thing, because that was the practical point. But my guess is that, what happened in that room where this happened was 90% philosophy, 10% politics. I don't know if anybody agrees or disagrees with that, but that's the way that I break it down.
I think that's fair. I think it's like, what were we talking about again? Oh yeah, the Capitol and the Treasury. That and who was going to pay for this war that we just had?
Well, and I think that's right, Don. That it was tilted way towards the philosophical, but I don't think we want to downplay that Jefferson could be a real political dogfighter. Yep. And so I think we have this idea of him as sort of this philosopher king in many ways, and there's some good reason for that. But I think in a lot of ways, I think he was actually very shrewd. I mean, this whole scenario was in many ways concocted because Jefferson was so shrewd and saw opportunity here with a finding a disheveled and in many ways disgruntled Alexander Hamilton, who is dismayed at the failure of his ability to get this deal done.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, Eric. I think that's portrayed in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical, that sort of he's on. But, the other things that I started reading here is that, Hamilton's like, if I can't get this done, I'm done. I'm done. And it may have even been what sort of suggested is that Washington told him, go get this done. You need to get this done. And, to what degree was there an air of desperation around what was going on in the room? In fact, again, I can't help but keep going back to the song lyrics in my head, two Virginians. There's two Virginians in the room, and then there's Hamilton. He's outnumbered even in the room by the Virginians that are there. Although I don't think he was probably ever thought he was outnumbered in terms of making an argument by anybody, no matter how many of them there were. But thinking through back to what you just mentioned there, Eric, Hamilton had a lot on the line here personally, not just the nation didn't. It wasn't only the nation that had a lot on the line here. Hamilton had a big stake personally in what was happening in this fight.
Well, and that's why he basically just said, I don't really have a dog in this fight about where the Capitol really is. I really don't care. I care about the debt thing. So I'll basically agree to whatever I need to agree to get my part of this thing handled. Because you're right. Washington basically said, I don't care what happens. Just make it happen.
Get it done. And get it done.
To think about this, I do find something just jumped into my head. Both sides are giving up something they do not think is necessarily that important. You look at Hamilton doesn't care where the Capitol is. Having been to Monticello, Jefferson's idea is of the yeoman farmer who lives out in the middle of nowhere and produces whatever he needs and comes to town once a month or whatever like that. In other words, somebody who is not necessarily going to be affected much by the tariffs, which are what the financial instrument is going to be to pay for the assumption of the debt. So almost this is the perfect political deal because both sides get something very important to them without giving up something important to them.
Okay, I can see that. Some of you know Brody Burton, who is the Imagine If podcast, who's joined us for some things. And Brody was kind enough to throw some thoughts into the forum at aforkandtimepodcast.com. And so I wanted to throw out some of his questions here. I thought he made some interesting insights and connections I hadn't quite made. This takes place 2 months after Benjamin Franklin dies. If you still have an active force in a Ben Franklin or somebody else, one of those original, sort of mover instigator shaker kind of founding fathers. I mean, Adams is around, but he's the vice president, which we know what John Nance Garner said about that position. But
And we know what Adams thought about that position.
exactly. So I thought Brody's comment about Franklin was interesting. Do you think this is different if it's got a different set of players? I guess is my point, whether that's Franklin or somebody else. Is there something unique about this compromise that is a Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton thing? Or would it have happened sort of regardless of who of that, large group of original founding fathers that are there that are in whatever position, they have to make something happen? Was it more likely to happen regardless, or is this something that's personality driven?
No, I think it's probably partly personality driven, Don, but I also think that somebody like Benjamin Franklin is going to come at this certainly with his own set of biases. But I think he was also shrewd enough to know when to leave something alone when it needed to be left alone. The one thing that's interesting about Franklin is, obviously we associate him with being in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania had a lot to lose in terms of the capital for this. So even though Alexander Hamilton, being from New York, may not have cared all that much, there are a lot of people in Pennsylvania who very much cared about the capital and wanted it to either be in Philadelphia, moving from New York, or to create a new capital somewhere else in Pennsylvania. So I wonder if Franklin would have had the sense to stay out of it in many ways, or if he would have tried to put his thumb on this as a Pennsylvanian.
Right. And
I think he may have stayed out of it because one thing comes to mind. The Constitution had already said that this federal district is non-state. That means Pennsylvania gives up Philadelphia if Philadelphia becomes the capital.
Or as you pointed out, you pick some obscure part of land you're willing to give up, and I remember when Alexis and I did the episode on the hurricane history about the War of 18. I have this bad image of thinking about Washington as it exists today in my head when I'm thinking about the War of 1812. It was nothing, it was a couple of buildings on a prairie in the middle of nowhere. That was the capital. Thank you very much.
It was swamp.
By the way,
DC becomes the capital because
wonderful...
all these states are like, you can have this land, it's fine.
Yeah.
We don't really want it.
I also enjoy that nobody else on this conversation walked half a mile to a freaking subway station in that heat today, and you all get it though. But again, hey, by the way, where did the capital of Pennsylvania wind up?
Yeah.
Harrisburg, right. Smack in the middle of the state, not Pittsburgh, not Philadelphia.
Well, and there was a town that was originally called Wright's Ferry in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that was trying to vie to be the capital, the capital of the U.S. Because it wasn't Philadelphia. To your point, Chris, Philadelphia is something you may not want to give up, even if you're a Pennsylvanian. But maybe this tiny town of Wright's Ferry in Lancaster County, maybe you don't really care because again, it's just a little tract of land on the Susquehanna. But as it turns out, it obviously didn't get it, and then they wanted to be the capital of Pennsylvania, and as you said, they decided to go with Harrisburg instead. So yeah, it's there's a gamble there if you're trying to be a capital city, an aspiring capital city.
And again, most of the well, exactly right. Well, and the other thing I wanted to ask, just throw out to the panel here, that sort of relates to that is, it goes back to the question that was raised earlier about just the importance of the capital. If you thought, Jefferson lived where when he lived in Paris, because that was the capital of France. London is the capital of
United Kingdom
of Great Britain. United Kingdom. I know how all of that works, but I have to stop and think about what's England, what's the United Kingdom, what's Great Britain. But traditionally in the larger cities there, and to your point, we had specifically said this was going to be a federal district. It was not going to be part of any state or thus part of any city. So even if you'd put it inside of New York City or put it in Philadelphia, you would have carved out a territory to do that inside of.
Which, by the way, a lot of people talking about DC statehood are talking about exactly that, carving out a central region of Washington, which is primarily offices and federal buildings, and in the outer areas that are more residential, those would be
State of Columbia, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that has me circle back around to just the concept of how this even got in there and why that, it's easy to see how we had to have the discussion about, we have this debt, how is it going to be paid, who's going to assume it. What was so important about having this federal district? Why was the capital as something separate other than the example that I gave earlier? Why was that so critical?
I think what you end up with, you have this is where all your ambassadors are going to live. This is the headquarters of the Army. This is the headquarters of the Navy. Granted, at that time, going to be a small officer corps kind of thing, but government's there, so all your services that support government end up. It's an economic thing. I think that it's pure economic driven at that, economic and status.
Okay.
This is in our it's near our state, but it's the economy piece. And I think the other thing is, I don't think they realized how much they would need or would not need, because we talked earlier and we brought up, they took a section of Northern Virginia and then they decided, oh yeah, we don't need that much. You can have it back.
Well, and I think you're right about that,
It-
Robert. It is economics and it is status, but but I think again it becomes in many cases the essence of compromise. I mean, how many states around the country have a capital that makes no sense other than the fact that it's centrally located? So I live in Missouri. So what's our capital? Jefferson City. You guys ever been to Jefferson City? Don't worry about it. So but it just happens to be halfway between Kansas City and St. Louis, and so that's where you put the capital.
The one thing I think about is that's a European or a modern way of looking at what a capital means. During 1812, the reason the British landed and went right for Washington was because that's what you did. You took the capital, and that was the end of the war.
It was capture the flag.
That was not the end of the war. Washington meant at this point, and by the way, this is 20 years later, meant next to nothing. My air conditioner is on the fritz right now. Trust me, it is uninhabitable in July. I mean, right up until the 1930s, the New Deal and the post-war expansion, Washington is not anything at all when it comes to economics. I mean, you still look at even today, kind of the schedule of Congress, that's a part-time job to some extent. They are not in session that much. So I think they designed a very good system. I do not think that when they were putting together the Constitution, they envisioned the Pentagon. They envisioned, the entire consulting industry, the economic impact the federal government has on this area today.
And that leads, I think, to the other question I want to ask. This is often framed by people who look back on it as Hamilton being a proponent for quote unquote big government, and Jefferson and Madison being proponents for quote unquote small government. These will eventually become the Federalists, and then the Democratic Republicans, which eventually will become the Democratic Party as we think of them today, if you really want to play it all the way down. But if you want to frame it that way, I think that's fair to frame it that way, more centralized government versus decentralized government. But was Hamilton really advocating for a quote unquote modern big government concept, or did it just seem big to the way that they thought of government back during the day?
I think it was big to their thoughts. And I think his experience was driven by being on Washington staff and seeing how inefficient the system was for fighting a war at a national level. I think he felt that they had to have a stronger central government. I don't think they thought it anywhere near as big as it's grown today, but I felt that they thought they had to have a strong central government if they were going to do nation things.
To think about, but to say this, if they envisioned what the federal government has become today, there's no way you would bargain that away for anything economically.
Right. You would look at it differently. Eric, were you about to say something?
No, I was just gonna. I completely agree with Robert, and I think they were still in many ways traumatized by the Revolutionary War, and we're looking at the prospects of being invaded by well at that point not quite the United Kingdom, Great Britain at that point, but they were looking at the prospects of being invaded by Great Britain, by invaded by somebody else, and realized how challenging that was going to be without some sort of cohesive response.
Yeah, I think I appreciate Robert saying that, because when again, if you think back to how that's portrayed in the musical Hamilton, part of the inspiration for where we got the title here, but if you read any of the biographies of Washington or Hamilton, Turnell's biography of him, most of the Revolutionary War is fought with an incredibly underfunded, undersupplied. I mean, it's only by force of personality in many ways that the army is held together. That's why Washington is such an incredible figure, because nobody was getting paid, nobody was getting fed, nobody had what they needed. They were begging Congress, which had no means really to raise funds. It wasn't that the Congress didn't want to support. Again, they had no means of providing for support. Were the states, and the states had their own interest in taking care of their own needs and their own before they did that at the federal level. I do agree that part of it is, Washington and Hamilton, by the same respect, somewhat traumatized by what it was like to really be dependent upon this thing that you've created called a government, realizing that it has to be sufficient. And Jefferson didn't experience that. He's over in France. Madison experienced that a different way, because on the he's on the congressional side of things. He's on the legislative side of what's happening there, not the field actual operational side of things. And we're all influenced by our experiences. I mean, that's part of the reason I think Hamilton was so adamant about the need for this. As you well point out, he had lived it recently and was scared what would happen if he had to live it again.
And we're 9 years from the end of the Revolutionary War at this point. Ends in 1781 at Yorktown, more or less. And this is not only 9 years later. And if you have to think about it, when you go to write the Constitution, think about what happened. They weren't supposed to write a Constitution.
Right. They were just
It was
supposed
a
to fix
couple of
the
y'all get
articles.
together and make a couple of amendments to the Articles of Confederation to make it better.
Yeah, fix that thing. Well, we can't fix that thing. We've got to raise it to the ground and rebuild it from the ground up.
Uh, just to think, I think each of these people we're talking about have very different roles in winning that independence, and very different roles in their view of what did lead to it. So you've got the Hamilton, who's with the Continental, who, this is the national army, and that's what's going to win it for us. Madison is more focused on Virginia and the state, while Jefferson's in Paris, that nice French fleet that stopped the British from relieving the siege at Yorktown. So that, they're coming at this from different ways of, even if we needed to, how could we preserve our independence? And you have a Jefferson thinking, well, we can just call on our friends the French again. So that's another thing that I'm playing around with in terms of their experiences, and also just to kind of start a discussion. Did it make sense? Was it the responsibility of Georgia to pay for Valley Forge?
They didn't think so, and probably rightfully so. Again, I think we have this very difficult thing that we do from a modern perspective of, it's hard to set aside our understanding of things when we look back in time. Even when we make the effort to do so, you just can't totally decouple yourself from your perspective on things. But we look at America post Civil War, a modern America, and industrialized. I remember when I was in college getting my degree in political science, one of the big topics in the 80s was the new federalism. That was actually the term that was given to it, to sort of represent how it was different from what had grown as a result of New Deal and World War II and the things that happened there, where the federal government became far more powerful relative to states. This idea of the new federalism, we need to return power back to the states. That's carried forward now. That's been a number of years. That's still going on out there. And this is where I wanted to go maybe for like the last thing we would kick around is that this is called, the dinner table bargain. There's that idea that, it's almost a little bit dirty. There was a, bargain cut behind closed doors kind of thing. But the other term that we use to describe it is the compromise of 1790. And Robert, I think you hit upon that. There's three great compromises that all go by. You got 1820, then you got 1850. They're all the compromise. They have slightly different names in some instances. One of them picks up the Missouri Compromise, thing because Missouri's involved. But was compromise a dirty word in 1790, or was it as dirty a word in 1790 as many people may think of it in 2021? I mean, where are we now as a nation when it comes to even doing that C word?
No.
Well,
I don't think it's as dirty then. I think I think if we look at politics as the art of the possible, I think that we by definition have to compromise. And so I don't think the compromise is as dirty of a word then. I don't think compromise was as dirty of a word when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s as it is now. And so I think and I'm going to go ahead and get a little political. I'm not going to show my cards, but I would say, compromise has become, has kind of given way in many ways to ideological purity in modern politics. And I think if you're coming at this from the standpoint of ideological purity, then compromise is a dirty word. And I find that unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can call. I don't like using the word compromise for the compromise of 1790 because as we've talked about, the two sides really didn't care what they gave up, as long as they got what they needed. So that's not a compromise to me. It's like I'll give you what you want as long as you give me what I want. I'm not giving up what I want because I really don't care. I don't have a dog in that fight. So I don't like using the word compromise for the compromise of 1790 in the same way we use it for the compromise of 1820, the compromise of 1850, because it's not a compromise. It's you give me what I want and I'll let you have what
I think
you want,
that's
I think
that's a valid point, Alexis. I think it's
So-
valid that that to use the language in a way that's precise. So what would you call it? Would you call it the bargain?
I guess I would call it a bargain because it's like, okay, cool. You gave me what I want. I'll let you have what you want. And we both come out and we're okay. But I think compromise has become a dirty word because compromise. I think the word compromise assumes that I'm going to have to give you something. I'm going to have to give up something. And we're not willing to do that. And, I'm not going to show my cards either, but I think there's that connotation to compromise that we don't like.
To piggyback a little off of what Eric was saying, this and to kind of throw in some Alexa stuff here too. It's pre-parties. I mean, right now we have and part of this is looking back. We call the Jeffersonians the first Democrat Republicans, and these names are starting to be applied, but they haven't stuck, and the two parties haven't cleaved yet, haven't really formed. And I think that's a big part of what Eric is talking about when it comes to ideological purity. I think the sorting of politics into two parties, and by the way, the sorting of the two parties into ideological groupings, I think, is a relatively modern political development. If we're still talking about the New Deal, I mean, you've got Henry Wallace and John Nance Gardner, or even better, Henry Wallace and Strom Thurmond in the same political party for some reason at some point. And that started changing. And I think that kind of led to ideological parties rather than almost two tribes, two coalitions looking to pull people away from the other party just to put together something that will gain them a majority in Congress or the presidential election.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think, and I'm going to jump on with what Chris and somewhat Eric. I agree, and I agree with Alexis. I think it was the bargain. I think bargain is a much better word for it. And I think what you see, I think what comes out of this is I think this bargain leads to the establishment of the proto parties. You start getting the birth of the parties out of this bargain. And like Alexis, and I think Don, you mentioned it too. I had the misfortune of going and listening to the room where it happened on YouTube today with the lyrics. So now it's stuck in my head. And Alexis, and you listen to it, who ends it and what does he say? He doesn't say in the room. He says, I want to be in the room where it
In the
happens.
room.
Right. And it's, you know, the interesting thing about that, again, tying it back, it's sung from the perspective of somebody who is not
In the room.
in the room.
In the
And so
room.
it becomes an insider outsider kind of thing, which is how a lot of modern politics now plays
Mhm.
out. Again, you know, what drives that in this idea. And there's a question there, you know, there's an element from Burr's perspective, by the way, again, borrowing a lot from the musical here, but that borrows from history in a lot of ways. You know, Burr is the ultimate pragmatist. You know, the whole point that Hamilton makes in the musical, again, not letting the musical take the place of history, but it comes from history, is, you know, what do you stand for? You'll say anything to get elected. You'll hold any position. uh Burr was in some ways the proto modern American politician. Not that that's unique to America, and from a politics standpoint, but this idea of, you know, what do I believe? Well, what does the majority of the voters believe? That's what I want to know, because I can adapt and be whoever you need me to be, as that goes on. And again, told from the perspective of somebody outside the room. That's why I think what happened in the room, as I was thinking it through, was far more philosophical than political. It was, you know, what should we be, not what will we do, but what should we be doing and why, which is very different than what we get, I think, in so much of our politics today, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. Chris?
Two things. One, I do find it interesting. You're right in that there has been the development of an insider outsider um, political narrative, but I'm going to go ahead and ask a question without tipping my hand. Both parties make the claim that they're the outsiders. So
Both parties lie.
that's an interesting thing. The other thing I would say is this: I feel it's the opposite of what you're talking about. I feel like modern politicians are not the Aaron Burrs, and maybe better if they were the Aaron Burrs, because they are ideological. They're stuck. You and how shocked were people when Mitt Romney started crossing the aisle and taking what people thought were Democratic positions? It was shocking. So maybe we need Burrs who will say what they need to build a coalition to get something done, rather than philosophes who, to malign a president I've talked about a lot, Woodrow Wilson, believe they're right and just believe everyone else should accept that they're right and go along with whatever they're saying. That a good compromise does not make.
Right. Well,
Right. And so I think if you want a modern analog to, and again, I'm not saying this in a bad way or a good way, just a neutral way. If you want the modern analog to Aaron Burr, it's clearly Bill Clinton. I mean, I think he's, and whether you like him or whether you don't like him, I think he was a political chameleon, several times during the course of his career. So he started out as a president in 1992 as what I would consider to be a mainstream Democrat, and then he ended his career into when he left office in 2001. And I think you could argue in many ways he was a moderate Republican, in a lot of his positions, at least a modern Republican for that time.
yeah, and you know, these labels do move over time, as we all know as well, and they alter. But I do agree that the nature of politicians today are locked into philosophical positions that they can't get themselves out of, even if they chose to, because you do so at the risk of having your own electorate that you depend upon turn upon you, or the thing that you need, which is funding to get elected, turned off from you, which will create a problem. And the one thing about those three guys in the room, I keep going back to that. They were in there representing, yes, interests, Virginia, their ideas about, agrarian versus an industrialized economy, but they were in there representing themselves a whole lot more than they were representing the other things. They were representing those interests because that's who they were. So it by naturally represented those interests, but they were in there as individuals. And certainly while we later, Democratic Republicans are calling Hamilton a Federalist, those became legitimate party labels, but not like we know legitimate party labels today by any stretch of the imagination. And even later, thinking back again to modern political history, I cut most of my modern political teeth on politics in the 80s. That was when I was in high school and then in college. And, did Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan agree on everything? No. But could they get in a room and do the type of thing that would be a bargain at the dinner table for what they thought of as being the common interest of the country? The absolute answer is yes. I have a very difficult time imagining in our current context, and again, whichever side of the aisle you're on doesn't matter to me, or which side I'm on. Very few people are willing to cross the aisle because you immediately get ostracized for crossing the aisle. That's a sin, regardless of whether you did it for a good reason or a bad reason. That is different in 2021 than it was in 1790. Heck, even different than it was in 1990. From my perspective, I think that's part of what has changed.
I agree, Don.
Yeah.
I agree completely.
Yeah, the stories that come out of the 80s were when something needed to get done, Reagan and Tip went and had a beer and everything got settled while they were sitting there drinking their beer.
Yeah, I'm, and again, not to make it too much about modern politics, but again, this is what's different than a fork in time. We can go here, and I don't mind going here. I think about a fellow Texan. In this case, I'm thinking about George W. Bush. And for those of you that lived in Texas, the situation that he had in the state of Texas when he was governor. The governor of Texas can't do much. The nature of the constitutional structure of Texas government is the governor of Texas is a weak position. Yes, you have a veto position. It's the lieutenant governor in the state of Texas that really carries a lot of the power because he's the bridge between the executive, so to speak, but he also is very heavy-handed in terms of the legislative position, even though it's an executive position. Well, he had a guy by the name of Jim Bullock, who was the
Bob.
Bullock. Yeah, I'm sorry, not Jim Bullock. Who was the lieutenant governor, and Bob was an old school Texas Democrat power politician type. And there's a great story. I won't go into the whole detail of that, but there was something that Bush wanted and needed Bullock's help to get. And they're sitting in the governor's mansion in Austin. And the two of them are going to loggerheads, and an expletive gets uttered by one to the other. Said, "Well, if you're going to do that, you have to come kiss me first." And so there's this great story of Bush going around the breakfast table and sort of trying to kiss Bullock, sort of making the point. They both start laughing about it. Well, 5 minutes later, they come to a conclusion about how they're going to accomplish this, and each of them again is going to get. It's compromised. It's political. They're each going to get something that they want. And I really believe, this is my personal take, this is political, that when George W. Bush was elected to the presidency in 2000, he thought he could go to Washington and do a similar thing, where he could actually, he talked a lot about bipartisanism. Education probably is one of the political subjects you can actually get some bipartisan support on. Everybody wants their kids to have a good education. So when he was going in to do that, now he got hijacked in some degree, I believe, by 9/11. That changed his entire presidency for better or worse or just different. But that's only been 30 years ago. I'm sorry, that's been 20 years ago, that all of this was happening. And back to Eric's point, Clinton 30 years ago, there was the ability to get things like that done. And I don't see that today. So when I look at something like the Compromise of 1790, I'm go, that seems so foreign. That seems so long ago. It is, but that actually is more representative of 200 years of American political history versus the last 20 years of American political history, at least from my perspective.
We've had a capability to get things done that we've lost over time.
Yeah. And And having
Yeah.
said in this case, again, using the 1790 compromise as the point, should we have gotten it done? Should Hamilton have gotten what he wanted, or should that's a legitimate question. But when it came time to get it done, it got done, and then we go on from there.
So
Yeah,
one
I
thing-
think if we agree, if we like the idea of the modern nation state, then I think we like what happened. If we don't like that idea, if we don't want to be a modern nation state, then sure, we don't like that idea.
Yeah.
But I think those of us who are here probably like that idea.
Yeah, and I think our listeners, I'm sure, will have different perspectives on that, as well they should. That's one of the benefits that we have for living in a republic where we have the freedom of thought. But there is something I think drastically different about how things have come to be. And even as I'm looking here, I'm looking on my screen, I'm looking at Brody's comment about big government, small government, and realizing even today how that would be defined by the two different parties is very different than it was 20 and 30 years ago, and certainly back during the time that was here. Anything we missed, guys? Anything big? I have a way I'm going to close this out, but I want to give another shot there.
Bush was from Connecticut. The last Texas president we had was LBJ.
By the way, tune into a series of episodes in November where we'll feature future President Johnson, probably to a great degree. I'm just teasing something. We'll be talking a lot more between over the next couple of months. This is how I think I want to close out or include this in most episodes as just a way of sort of bringing things home. You can decide what these terms mean to you as we go around and do this, but Compromise of 1790, high note, low note, footnote. Now I'll let Alexis go first.
Oh, dang. Don't put me on the spot. Oh goodness. Okay, so high note, low note, footnote. This is hard. And to be fair, I did not know that he wanted to close it out this way, so he kind of threw this at me, and I'm not prepared. I think high note for me is kind of what we talked about, in that calling it a compromise is not fair, and we've talked about that. It was a bargain, but I think a high note for me is realizing that they were able to accomplish what they set out to do. They accomplished what they set out to do with figuring out how debt was going to be handled. They accomplished getting the capital situated where it was going to be. So that I think is the high note for me, and that it actually did what it was supposed to do. Whether we want to call it a compromise or not, we can talk about that. But high note for me is that it did what it was supposed to do. I can't really think of a low note for me, but I guess the low note would kind of be on the flip side of that. It's kind of got this misnomer, and the fact that it wasn't really a compromise; it was a bargain. I think we kind of tend to maybe oversimplify things in history, or broad stroke things in history, and I think that this is one of those instances where we, people know about it because of a song in a Broadway musical, but they don't necessarily know about the nuances of it and what went into it, and the fact that it was a lot of philosophical discussion. So I think the low note for me is that it has kind of become this, however long the song is, 3-minute, 4-minute song in a musical, when it was a big decision back in 1790. We've tended to kind of simplify it, and I think the footnote for me would just be the fact that kind of the reason why this podcast got started. The fact that this took place in a room in a house. It's one of those little decisions that you, when you look back on things and you realize how big something was, and then you look back and say that was sitting on a couch in a parlor. It's kind of that anecdotal part of history that I loved. I've always loved. So it's just kind of those little quirks, those little footnotes of history, the little details of history that tend to get left out of where these things happened and what happened and conversations that took place. So those would be my three, I think.
Robert, high note, low note, or footnote? You don't have to answer all three, by the way. You can pick one if you want.
I'll do real.
Okay, you didn't give me
No,
that option.
hey, you're a coach.
No, I definitely got that from what he
Yeah,
said.
So high note, the establishment of the ability of the government, full faith and credit, for us to be able to do finance as a country. Low note, probably the proto party that came out of this, that ended up really splitting it out. And then footnote, really Aaron Burr at the end in the song. For me, that's the footnote, because it does start to create this idea of, you know what? There's this ruling class, and then there's everybody else. And I thought we fought a revolution to get rid of that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Chris?
High note is the founding of the United States is something other than a traditional nation state, in that we are going to work with people and regions different from our own to build a gestalt state, if I can call it that. We're not France, where everybody speaks the exact same language and is from the same stock and has everything in common. We're something different, and this is the beginning of that America, where we're going to be together, and we're not going to get everything we want or the other person wants, but that cooperation creates something more than we could achieve on our own.
Okay.
Low note. Creating a city that, in the words of John Kennedy, has northern charm and southern efficiency. I've been down on where I live. It's July. If we have this conversation in January, my opinions are probably pretty different. Footnote. It seems interesting to me that it just happened where it happened. In that what we've talked about is this just makes perfect sense. I mean, a good horse trader looks at this and says, well, Hamilton, you don't care where the capital is. Madison, you want it near Virginia. You don't care about where the tariffs go. You just make that happen. So it just seems like a natural, like, why were we fighting over this for any period of time at all when just sit down and make it happen. Make that deal.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, kind of building off of what Chris said about the high note, I feel like this bargain is one of the first instances where we see federalism in practice, and I think that to me that's, you could argue that history has been a bit fraught, but I think overall to me that's a high note, is that we're seeing federalism work in that way. I think the low note, I would also agree with Chris here that the low note is, you're building your national capital in a swamp, and I have to say, I'm sorry, Chris, I'm not a big fan of DC, but they should.
It's not for everybody. I get it.
Yeah, so we'll talk off podcast about my experiences in DC. And then the footnote is, I think this gets Alexander Hamilton's political career off of life support for a while, because this was existential for him, and the fact that this worked out in a way that he could claim victory kind of meant that he lived to fight another day, and that's interesting.
I would agree with those. I'll chime in really quick. I think I would agree with the high notes here. It's important. It's hard for me to consider this rose to the level of crisis for the country or existential, but you could argue, if you want to take the what if turn on this, maybe there should be a podcast that does that. Is if this doesn't happen, it probably is a different America, at least early on there. And then potentially you have to wonder, does it have the opportunity to survive the next first test when it needs the resources to be able to survive, whether that's taking advantage of the fact that Napoleon is in a situation where he needs some cash quick and he's got some land, let's make a deal, or whether it's the War of 1812 or whatever it is. If this doesn't happen, you're not as set up for success. I think the low note I would echo, I forget exactly who said it, maybe the one is the fact that it already created the concept of I got to be in the room, that there were the haves and the have nots, even as I think Robert, even though we just fought a war over this, right? How did we end up here? Well, because that's the way it works. That's the way it's always worked in human history to some way, shape, form, or fashion. So to me, that's the low note, is that for all of the ideals of the American Revolution, yeah, it's still politics, man, at the end of the day, and you can't get away from it. And I guess the footnote is the fact that, this didn't happen in DC, because it didn't exist yet. This happened in New York. This happened in the place where it could have been. I've often thought about, I think we even mentioned this on the podcast episode that Alexis and I did on AFIT, was I can imagine a scenario where we would have carved out what eventually became Central Park and turned that into like the federal district inside of New York, where you could have had all of those, all the buildings you needed to have, the Capitol, the place where the court was going to reside and all that. But we didn't. This happened in New York because that was where things were at the time. So the footnote is the loser in the Capitol game. The only other one you may have given any great amount of hope for was Philadelphia, if it weren't going to be the problem of federal district. It happened in the place that was the loser in what happened because of what was decided there. And the very fact that they were there indicated it maybe should have been there, but it wasn't. It all sort of comes back around and rolls back together before it's all said and done. Well, I've enjoyed the time today, guys. Again, we don't have preconceived notions about what this is going to be, so it'll continue to evolve. But it was good to have this inaugural crew, and I appreciate each one of you coming along and participating. Eric, I'm glad you fought back through the technical difficulties to get back with us, because I knew having you here was going to be a part of this. So just to set things up for our audience, right now, if you want to check out more, give us feedback on suggesting potential rooms, the place that you would do that would actually be at a forkintimepodcast.com. We haven't broken this podcast out from the mothership. We may never do it in terms of what goes on with the online presence there, but you'll find links in the show notes here to get to where you need to go. And we'll ask you to stick with us as we get after the break here, because again, the format is that what you will hear after the break is the setup for room number 2. And what I'll encourage you to do, as I will during that particular setup, is we've set up the forums there on the website to go in, and a podcast is an one-way audio medium, so it's tough to make it a dialogue environment. It's not designed to do that very well. But our idea here is to throw out the topics in such a way that before we get to the recording of the next episode, we've had a chance to hear back from you about what that might ought to look like. So stay tuned after the next break. You'll get the introduction to room number 2 as a topic. And that means the clock is ticking on you as an audience participating in getting us information back. By the way, that means you as an audience might become you as a participant if you're so inclined to do so. Throw your hat in the ring. That's how Eric's here. That's how Chris is here. I knew Robert, he was going to get roped in whether he wanted to be or not, but he could have just as easily found us this way. So we're trying to build the community and reach out to what's there.
And Alexis, how do you know her?
Yeah, that whole, contributed DNA thing to her and, that whole bit. But again,
You're never going to get your future son-in-law on any podcast.
Yeah,
Sorry.
It's hard to get him to listen to something, a podcast probably. He's quiet. Alexis will make up for that. We'll put it that way. Jake is quiet.
That will be our project, Alexis. We will get him on.
Good luck.
I can't even think from what I know of my future son-in-law. I can't even think of what topic would even entice him in the area of history. But we may be able to get him here at some point, guys. I really do appreciate.
What if he wouldn't have met Alexis? There you go.
There you go.
We all know it will involve Great Britain.
Yes. Although I'll tell this anecdote very quickly. Everyone knows we make fun of Alexis being an Anglophile, and she is. Someone yesterday actually asked if we were interested in, they were giving away, I guess, a fairly large, like the type of thing you'd almost put over a sofa type of painting. It was Parliament, Big Ben was the type, and Alexis said no. And I'm thinking that has something to do with her fiance. Alexis would have said yes. Jake's fiance now tempers that a little bit with whether or not that would be over their couch or in a room someday. So we'll see how that plays out. Guys, I do appreciate you. And does anybody have any just closing comments before we break off here to the break? And then coming back from the break, through the magic of editing post after the fact, you'll hear me talking about room number 2, because that'll be done separately. But anybody have any comments before we close out here discussion on room number 1?
Yeah, I do. I would just, this is to Alexis. I would say, if you think politics is the art of compromise, wait until you get married.
You're right, Eric. I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
That's why I feel empowered to wade into Texas discussion. Some of you know, my wife is from Dallas, so yeah, that's
well,
yeah.
well, and my future sister-in-law lives in DC. So
Really?
yes, she does.
Does she, now, by the way, this is just something interesting. Does she live in?
No, she lives in
just a
Arlington.
weird little. Yeah, nobody lives in DC.
She lives in Arlington.
They cut the city to what they thought a city would be in the 1700s. It's 68 square miles. It is 1/10 the size of Houston. Just not physical land area. Yeah. Nobody lives in DC.
Yeah.
I say I live in DC. I don't live in Maryland.
It's interesting to me that the whole thing about this, of course, is the placement of the Capitol, and what we're talking about here is all the things that are placed around the Capitol, right? Because there's nothing actually in the Capitol itself. All right, guys. Again, I appreciate you. I appreciate our listeners listening in. Participate with us. Spread the word. We're a new burgeoning podcast. I think we'll find an audience that's for this podcast that's not for Fork in Time. So if you know somebody who likes both, they're both out there now, but this is also geared to something different. And until next time, we'll see you on the other side of the room door number 2. Thanks.
Don and Alexis, taking a little break from the podcast today because we talk all the time about what are we trying to build out there, Alexis?
A community.
A community. A community has more than one element to it.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we've come to enjoy over the course of doing the podcast here for slightly more than a year and a half now, wow, is getting to know people that have found us on the web and have not become listeners, but also become contributors and become some of our friends in the podcast community. Recently, we featured him on one of our episodes, and we were featured on one of theirs. We had a chance to encounter Brody Burton. And Alexis, Brody has a podcast, and what's it called?
Imagine If.
Imagine If. And so we wanted to once again just mention that, again, in the spirit of what we said we're all about, being true to that, we're about a community. So we're suggesting to you again, if you found our podcast and you like it, but perhaps you did not hear the episode that had Brody, you're having a chance once again to hear about Imagine If. One of the things that astonishes me about Brody is a young man. Brody is, I think, a freshman in high school, and he's chosen to do this at a very young age, and he's doing it very well. So it is worthy of encouragement and worthy of us suggesting that you want to be a part of that. So you can find it. Do a Google search. There'll be a link in this particular show and in other show notes. There's a link on our website. So if you go to www.aforkintimepodcast.com, you'll find links that will get you to Brody's podcast. But again, we want to be sincere about saying that we're looking to build a community here. So part of that is pumping up and suggesting there's other things out there. And Brody's podcast is different than ours. You may find you like it better or worse, or just that it's different. But we would encourage you to check it out.
Absolutely.
Thanks for sticking with us after the break and coming back to hear the introduction here to what will be room number 2 on the room where it happened. Since this is all sort of still new to many of our listeners, I'm going to explain it again. We won't do this every time. But the concept is we want to have the opportunity for our listeners to provide some input and some participation before we actually get to the recording of the episode on a particular topic. So you just heard the episode recording for room number 1, the compromise of 1790, capital squared. And so now as we come to the end of that episode, we're going to introduce the topic that will be room number 2. Now the idea here is we're going to give you enough time to visit our forum or send us an email or other ways that you can interact with us. You can find all of those ways on www.aforkintimepodcast.com. That's the home of our original podcast, Fork in Time, but also the home of the room where it happened. And there, if you go to the forum, you will find a topic that's been posted that's specifically for this particular room that we're introducing here that will be the next episode's discussion topic among our panel. And so room number 2 is going to focus on 2066 Crist Drive in Los Altos, California. That room is going to be a garage, and it's going to be a famous garage. It's going to be the garage that is the sort of the mythical founding place, the birthplace of Apple computers. So room number 2, we're going to talk about the impact of Apple computers, beginning there in 1976, the mid-70s, with the production of the Apple I. And as legend holds it, that was there in the garage of Steve Jobs' house. And so room number 2 will be 1066 Crist Drive. If you have some thoughts on that, visit us at the website, www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Visit the forum and give us some thoughts and some input there as we will talk about the subject of how Apple has impacted the world. Hope to see you there. Thanks.